This is a panel on developing the developing world smarter. We've got a great panel here with a diverse background, all kinds of experience, geographical experience. We're hopefully going to be looking at success stories, also roadblocks and obstacles, to actually bringing energy solutions to the rest of the world, especially the base of the pyramid types, people who live off the grid, people who don't have access to energy. There's roughly 1.3 billion people who have no access to electricity whatsoever. That has impacts on health, it has impacts on economic productivity, growth, life expectancy, everything. My name is Keith Johnson. I cover energy issues for the Wall Street Journal. I've been based in Europe most of my life, but I've been over here for a few years, so I've got a little bit of a different view on things than a lot of my colleagues, because I have done developmental issues in the Middle East, some in Africa, Europe, which I guess in Southern Europe, where I was based, is almost a developing country now. So that does give me some background in that area. What I wanted to do is kick this off with a few brief presentations from our three panelists, and that way we'll have time to delve into some questions. We'll also have questions coming from email and Twitter, I'm told. So hopefully we'll have a lively and robust discussion here over the next 45 or 50 minutes. The first speaker is Dr. Kate Steele. She's the Associate for Energy and Sustainability at Google.org. She joined their energy and sustainability team to focus on energy access after working as an energy specialist in the African Energy Unit of the World Bank. She was one of the program managers of Lighting Africa, where she worked a lot on solar LED, I believe. Prior to working at the World Bank, she consulted on energy access projects in South Africa, Tanzania, and Kenya, and she has a PhD, an MS, and a BS. So highly qualified, well experienced. Kate, welcome.
Great, thanks very much. So I am the one speaker that is going to show slides. They are only pictures. I figured it's mid-conference, right after lunch. It'd probably be good to keep your attention. And I also should add the disclaimer that I've only been with Google.org for a very brief amount of time, so everything that I'll talk about is primarily based on my previous experience with World Bank and other projects. So the 3 points that I want to make basically were about how these technologies could be developed in the developing world and then potentially come back to the US. That's how Mark Johnson from ARPA-E framed this problem for us. And that really resonated with me for 3 reasons, and they're based on price, people's behavior in the developing world, and the regulatory environment. And so first, just wanted to show a brief picture of this is what you're talking about for base of the pyramid energy. You've got kerosene, you've got maybe a solar lantern, if you have a little bit more money, maybe a PV panel. All of these people are paying in the dollar per kilowatt. This is a very expensive way to get your electricity. So if you're talking about environments that could possibly adopt solutions that are 20 cents a kilowatt hour, this is a pretty primed market. So there's another kind of thing about price is that people always say, well, these people are bottom of the pyramid. They can't afford anything. There's no ability to pay. So this is a pretty standard, very, very poor household. This happens to be in a remote area of Ghana. If you look at their rooftop, though, they have about 20 PV panels up on the top of it. So this is providing not only their household electricity, which is the larger panel, that's for their lighting system. They actually bought a bunch of solar lanterns and they're renting them out to all of their neighbors. So they've been able to get the capital not only for their own power system, but also to then become basically the village supplier of electricity. So again, there's money there that people are able to find solutions and probably could benefit from a lot more people looking at this as a potential market. So moving on to the second point as far as behavior, these are people that are thinking a lot about their energy system. That this isn't you go home and you flip on the lights. This is needing to think about paying for the solar lantern maybe, paying for a solar home system, every day charging it. These are people who are directly interacting with their power system. And it's not just off-grid, that if you're looking at the urban electricity systems, this is the guide from Kenya Power, looking at prepaid power. And actually, Richenda and I were talking earlier today about the stigma of prepaid power in Europe or the US. It's actually not nearly as much of a stigma in developing world, that it shows that you're actively able to manage your power consumption and your payments. That we had people in Kenya who had the regular postpaid meters and wanted to get these so that they would have better control over their power system. And part of the reason is it's really easy to use. Obviously, Kenya's pretty far along as far as mobile payments, and you're able to top up your electricity meter with your cell phone. So there's very low barrier to using this system, and you actually feel like you're in control, which really starts to make you think that demand-side management technologies and smart metering could be much faster adopted where people are already interacting with the system, as opposed to the US where it's cheap, it's reliable, and it's pretty much not something you have to think about. So final slide and final comment is on the regulatory environment that a lot of you, I'm sure, work in US markets and have tried to deal with utilities and various building codes and all of the regulatory barriers. And not to say that the developing world is a free-for-all, but I like this picture because this is a power system in remote Tanzania where inside of that little shack, someone's put in a generator, and you can see the wires. They've actually strung up the distribution system for this town, and even has a chair so you can sit there and monitor the system. And it's charging most of the businesses on the order of $1 a day for light bulbs. It's mostly serving the commercial center of this very small town. This is basically under the regulatory radar in Tanzania, that a lot of countries have regulations where below a certain threshold installation, it really doesn't have to be absorbed into the greater power system. It's a lot of opportunities to look at microgrids, to look at new technologies, when you don't have to think about interacting with utilities, interacting with quite as strong regulatory bodies. So that, hand over to, I don't know if you'll introduce Jeff.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Kate. I wanted to introduce Jeff Haeni. He's the Renewable Energy Advisor for USAID. He brings a broad geographical background, having worked in Africa with USAID. He was also a State Department officer based in Africa. And he worked on the Hill as a science advisor. So he's pretty much covered all the branches of government, and especially for developing issues. Jeff, take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, so I guess that makes me qualified to talk about what's the role of public sector funding when we talk about innovation, particularly in energy in the developing world. And USAID traditionally invests about $500 million to $1 billion per year in about 20 countries in the developing world in the clean energy and energy reconstruction sector. But historically, we've done very little on the science and technology and innovation side. And I think one thing that's quite interesting, I've met with countless number of private sector entrepreneurs and individuals throughout my career at USAID, and the conversation all typically goes in the same direction. That is, I've got a great technology, a great idea, I know there's a market for it in the developing world, but where do I start? And it's a very difficult nut to crack. And I think as the paragraph describing this session correctly articulates, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the developing world presents tremendous opportunity, both in terms of the economics of renewables, in terms of a tremendous number of unserved populations, those relying on very expensive diesel generation. On the other hand, it's traditionally a risk-adverse scenario. And if we want to look at the very small systems, the household systems, some of which Kate just showed, is it fair to ask a developing country rural family member that has saved 1 to 3 months' salary to invest in an energy system to bear the cost of that system failure because it was an innovation? Oh, sorry guys, it didn't work out in this case. No, that's not fair, clearly. If we move up the value chain, the utilities, the local financial institutions, all have, I would argue, a narrower margin for error in the developing world, both because of a lack of human capacity and a lack of financial resources. So I think a realization of this fact led USAID to reconsider our portfolio and to become, under the leadership of our current Administrator Shaw, much more engaged in the innovation space. We created a Science and Technology Office, and we have recently launched a whole series of grand challenges for development in the health sector, in the education sector, and most recently in the energy sector, focused squarely on this question of how do we promote innovation, and very similar to ARPA-E's mission, how do we find game-changing innovations in this space? Very quickly, the Energy Grand Challenge is focused on the nexus between energy and agriculture. It's called Powering Agriculture. And just to put in a brief plug, the call for proposals is still on the street. It's open until February 28th. So if you have a great idea, please visit poweringag.org. But we've partnered with the government of Sweden and Germany, Duke Energy Corporation, as well as the African Development Bank, to try to provide some of this early stage financing for innovation, which is very, very difficult to come by in the developing world. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Richenda.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Our final speaker here today is Richenda van Leeuwen. She's the Executive Director of the Energy Access Initiative in the Energy and Climate section of the United Nations Foundation. She's overseeing the UN Foundation's work on energy access, which is part of one of the three pillars of the UN Sustainable Energy for All initiative. And she also founded and leads the United Nations Foundation's Energy Access Practitioner Network, which is a huge global network catalyzing market-led solutions for energy access in developing countries. She came to the UN Foundation from Good Energies, which was a renewable energy private equity firm. She's also, prior to that, worked as the Executive Director of Trickle Up, an international micro-enterprise nonprofit. So, Ms. Van Leeuwen, you've got experience across the board, lots of different countries. Tell us what you've learned.
Thanks very much. I just want to build a little bit from Kate's comments and Jeff's comments as well. I mean, first of all, I could throw out there, if you're coming in from a business standpoint, in a sense, there is no developing world anymore. We were just saying before the session started, there's emerging markets. The reason I say that is there are markets. There are markets for energy everywhere in the world. The question is, how much are people paying for what they're getting, how sustainable it is as a supply, and what kind of solutions are available, and what's affordable to them as well. So just to put that out there, Kate was talking about some of the small-scale lighting solutions, and there is actually, people are paying about $37 billion US per year. The 1.3 billion people who live without access to any formal electricity at all are already paying about that much for kerosene, for dry cell batteries, and for candles. So that's already a sizable market there. The challenge is, of course, it's very fragmented, and it's not, it's not something that you can just necessarily tap into, because there are so many different countries involved that are all at different stages of development of their energy sector. So what I'd like to say just very briefly is, we're really looking at grid extension, but also grid reliability, and that's certainly something that we haven't always solved here. In fact, living in the part of Maryland I do, with apologies to Pepco, I felt sometimes that I was living in a developing country with the number of power outages we've had over the last year, and been very grateful for the small-scale solar-powered lighting and cell phone charging solutions that I keep at home, because they have been wonderful backup power solutions for my family when our house has been in the dark for days at a time. Hasn't saved the food in the freezer, but nonetheless it's been better than nothing. That said, I think where we're really seeing is, so there's grid extension, which will continue and tends to be the domain of governments. We were also talking before the session about when the grid comes, really, does that mean that everything else gets wiped off the map? And more we're seeing, no, in fact, some of these microgrid solutions where we should be looking at, from a technology neutral standpoint, but more from the standpoint of whatever solution set that you are building and promoting, it should be interoperable with the national grid down the pike, because then you have the opportunity to roll it out, so that even if you end up having the grid coming to that area, again, in principle, you actually have a means for some additional payments for whoever is owning the microgrid, which could be the community, or it could be a business that has a partnership with a particular community. So you can have some revenue flowing back to that community, particularly if it's a peak shaving mechanism for a larger grid. Now, I'm not a utility expert, so I leave it to the utility folks in the room to tell me that there is a there or there isn't. But what I can say is that there's a number of US utilities that are very interested in microgrids, not only in terms of powering cell phone base stations, which is an area that a lot of different people are looking at right now, but going beyond that as well, and trying to figure out, as Kate had said, where some of the regulatory environments, there's a plus and a minus for not having a strong regulatory environment at times, which means that you can have more capacity to try things out, where here the regulatory environment may be more difficult to allow that. Now, just coming back to sort of applications that are relevant to the US, I would like to say that I work very closely. We have a 1,000-member network that is market-led, primarily business-operated, running from very small startup businesses through VC-backed new technologies, through battery manufacturers, all the way up to some large corporations that are interested in this sector. We're also, we have membership from native Alaskans who are already paying $1 per kilowatt hour for their diesel-generated microgrids up in parts of Alaska, and they're saying that it is not only untenable in terms of some of the effects of climate incidents that they're already finding make it very difficult for life in those communities, but just it's unaffordable, and you're seeing migration of people to Anchorage because they cannot afford to pay their energy bills. So they've been asking us and coming to us saying, what do you have really from the developing world or from emerging markets that we can be bringing to our situation in Alaska? So it's a very real-time question about what do we have that's working in other parts of the world that we can be bringing back to communities in the US. It's not just a sort of a future scenarios issue that we're facing. Of course, one of the challenges is that a lot of the solutions that we're working with in developing countries tend to be much closer to the equator, and so solar PV, generally speaking, and I'm being very, very, very broad-based now in my comments, tends to have a lot of capacity. In Alaska, we have other issues in terms of extreme environments that mean that some solution sets are more viable than others. But I'll really conclude there by saying I think that one of the things is that we already have markets. They're just not necessarily working very well. It's extremely price point sensitive. So I toured around the exhibition hall below, and there were some really great solution sets that have been developed, particularly for military applications, that I think we see that they can be really great answers for some of the work that we're doing overseas, but it really is a question of price point in terms of initial capex as well as life cycle pricing as well, for how do you actually get this not only installed on a pilot basis, but how you can take it to scale. And I think we're about scale, because without the scale, it's very difficult to get the sustainability from a market standpoint. Having been in this sector for a number of years and having been working on development issues for more years than I care to admit to the audience here, I think one of the challenges that we've seen is very well-intentioned efforts that go wrong when you are coming from a purely aid-based mechanism that doesn't really have a supply chain, doesn't really have a maintenance system attached to it. And one of the reasons that we set up our practitioner network really to be focusing on market-led solutions is specifically to address some of the challenges we've had in the past of really not having the maintenance, not having the sort of the back-of-house solutions in terms of the training of technicians, ensuring that you have that human capacity to be able to maintain the solution set that you are installing. And again, I don't think that's a specifically developing world issue. It's something that even here in the States we struggle with, making sure that our colleges, our vocational institutes are training people with the skills that industry needs. And so really coming from a more system standpoint than through a pure technology play, I think is part of the key.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richenda. And I actually wanted to just kick it off by following up on that point, and this is for all three of you. But Richenda and Kate had spoken to this directly, which is this sort of dichotomy between an aid-based approach, which I guess prevailed over a number of years, and this idea of actually there are markets, they're just not functioning well. The trick is to resolve those market failures in a certain way in order to galvanize this. So what I wanted to ask you, and I know that the network's report has identified some of these problems that are out there. What are the market failures, the main ones that you identify in areas such as this? Is it simply financing? Is it a distributional problem? Is it a regulatory problem? Government transparency, corruption? What are the market failures that you identify most broad-based, and what ways can you actually tackle these in a short-term solution?
I'll actually maybe leave it to Richenda and Jeff on the demand-side market failures. But I think there's also a supply-side market failure that at Intersolar last year, I was talking to one of the lantern companies, and solar lantern companies, and someone came by and said, oh, could I buy 50 of these and give them away somewhere, village in Africa, help people out? And they said, absolutely, that's what we really want people to do. And at the time I was managing Lighting Africa, which was trying to develop these markets, and felt that I needed to say something. So asked her to please never do that. That's a horrible idea. And talking with the company afterwards, basically asked them what was their strategy with this. And they said, well, we developed this lantern. It's fantastic quality. It'll last longer than any of the other ones. But we know we are nowhere close to the price point that's going to work in these markets. So we're going to give them away. Which is essentially the same as Mercedes saying, we've designed this fantastically beautiful car that is very, very high quality, high performance, but we really don't think people can afford these, so we're going to give them away. Possibly to people that could have afforded a Ford Focus. So you've now killed the market for your product, and you've killed the market for everything below you that could have possibly worked there. So I think that that's something, there needs to be better recognition on the supply side, that you need to think about the markets. This is, it's not just the demand side that has failures.
I think it's also extremely dependent on the scale of technology you're talking about and obviously the country that you're working in. I just came back from Indonesia. Obviously, the market failures for the geothermal industry there, which essentially has not developed a geothermal plant in the past 10 years, despite some of the world's best geothermal resources, are quite different than the market failures for the microgrids on some of the 15,000 small islands in Indonesia. So the scale, all of the market failures you mentioned are present. It just depends what scale you're operating on, which depends which ones are greatly impacting your business. One of the things I'd like to build on is not a simply purely commercially viable or commercially oriented market approach versus donor-based approach, because we've swung back and forth over the years between those two extremes, saying, oh, this all has to be done by the public sector, a complete failure. There's absolutely no way that there's going to be enough financing to get to the solutions that we all want. Two, we don't have to worry about it. This is a problem that the private sector is going to answer. And we've also seen the failures there. And one of the things that we're seeing is that getting the appropriate flavor of money to support the appropriate stage along a project development cycle is very difficult. And you often see essentially free grant funding, whether it be from a traditional donor or a foundation, displacing money that perhaps angel investors would be able to accept the risk of a particular investment. You see angel investors sometimes placing investments where the local private commercial financial markets would be willing to accept the risk and return profile for those projects. It's been very difficult to get in a comprehensive way, even at a country level, the right flavors of money flowing in the right streams and working more as a public-private partnership model on a lot of these very challenging issues rather than simply saying, it's got to be one extreme or the other.
Yeah, I hesitate to agree because I think that Jeff and Kate and I, we may agree too much on this panel, and we don't want to be make for a boring panel that way. But I definitely see the role for public capital and public investment in certain areas. Again, with the idea that it's really markets that need to work as effectively as they can for this. In terms of the report that we came out with last year, we released at Rio from our members, they were really looking at several areas. First of all, access to capital is we all know that, anybody who's operating a business. in this space particularly, I would say that we still, in country, and again I'm being extremely broad in my remarks because we're covering so many countries and so many different contexts, but there still tends to be oftentimes a reluctance to support new solutions in a given market by the local banking sector. Often they're more risk averse around renewable energy technologies because they don't necessarily understand them well. So again, I'm speaking about something I've seen, I'm talking very generally right now. There are ways to get around that, there are ways to address that. In terms of early stage financing, certainly I would say every business in our network that has gone through the early stage side has struggled, so the role of things like business plan competitions has been extraordinarily helpful. We're seeing both the blessing and the curse of crowdfunding right now, which is sort of coming in as a proxy for friends and family financing. Blessing because it does actually open up a broader pool of capital for financing newer ventures. The curse, I think, is because the valley of death is such that if you don't have your, some sort of water with you, you're likely to die of thirst out there. And frankly, there are companies out there, there are solutions out there that actually, unfortunately, should not make it through the valley of death. And because of the lack of understanding of the market, or particularly I'm talking about some of these smaller scale lighting solutions right now, we're seeing some solution sets that 5-6 years ago when I was on the venture capital side we would not have funded then, now getting access to hundreds of thousands of dollars of crowdsourced capital to then take it to the next level, where in the industry we've been really focused, and Kate and I have worked on this together, on getting standards across the industry to help with a sort of a more a better global standard for what we see as quality in certain lighting solutions, really coming from a customer protection standpoint. Because if you are a customer, a consumer who can only pay $10 or $15 for a small scale lighting solution, you want to have one that you are pretty going to be pretty well assured that it's actually going to work for you and is not going to break down for 3 months. And so we've had a lot of variability in the sector in terms of the robustness of the solutions. So we're sort of working at this from all angles in terms of where the market failures are. We're addressing the standards piece as well as coming back to the policy side as well.
No, that's great. One thing I wanted to turn to right now is just sort of the thrust of this panel itself, which is how the experiences in this developing world can rebound to the benefit of the developed world. And I wanted to follow up on a point you made about in Alaska, you've got pockets of relative energy poverty there. But when we're looking at a lot of these solutions for the base of the pyramid, very small scale solutions, relatively expensive compared to what we have here with grid deals, how, in what way would you expect to see these things come back into the developed world? Would it only be in sort of niche areas such as Alaska where you have limited access, or is it something that you could use even in non-PEPCO areas of Maryland? Something that you could actually see scale up overseas, come back, and be a viable player here. How exactly does that happen? Because I'm not really clear.
I'll kick off with this one. I mean, I would say I'm not really clear either in some of these areas. I think the title of this was framed for us. I'm not sure we would have framed it exactly that way. I would say one of the things that, and again that Kate and I have talked about, is when you're in a very, very low constrained environment, it forces you to be better at your demand side management. And I think we're really looking at for example, I'm doing a lot of work now just beginning to really look at the energy and health sector and looking at hospitals. And when you've got only a certain capacity in terms of your power generation and you have constraints on your capacity, then you want to make sure that you really are bundling the most effective solutions in terms of energy efficiency. So I think one of the areas that I'm seeing, and again using a healthcare solution, it really excites me that Partners in Health in Haiti, working with the Ministry of Health in Haiti, has just built a brand new hospital, regional hospital in Mirebalais in the Central Plateau, that they've put already, I think, something approaching 0.5 megawatt of solar PV on the roof of that hospital. They are combining it with very good demand-side management, really looking at what is the essential load, what is the critical load for that hospital, and then sort of working from there in terms of how they then make it work within the hospital with some diesel backup for ensuring that whether it's the operating theatre, you know, the sustainability of the power for certain critical loads is going to be key. So they don't want the lights going off sort of halfway through a critical surgery. And then they do have some grid tie-in as well, but I don't have exactly all the information on how they're looking at the tie-in with the grid, but I know that the grid in Haiti is still very unreliable. So I think one of the things is that it forces people to think more about the constraints that are working on them, and that's something that I think we are all going to be looking at much more in the future. And then the second piece, and I'm sure this is a word that's going to be echoed by Jeff and Kate as well, is mini-grids, specifically looking at these distributed mini-grids. And as I said, I've been approached by some pretty large U.S. energy companies who say, well, we really want to try some of this out in other parts of the world and then bring back our learning to the U.S., because we do believe that down the pike we're going to see more decentralized solution sets. Now, whether utilities agree or not, I don't know, but there is a lot of interest in that right now.
So I'll actually leave the mini-grid comments for Jeff, because I do think we all agree on that one. But to your point about will these solar lanterns come back, no, I don't think so. That I had plenty of people who borrowed them from my office in DC when there was power outages. But I don't think that everyone's going to have small solar LED lanterns in their house anytime in the future in the US. But I think that those are really the base of the pyramid solutions. I think where there's greater potential for this bounce back, or even things starting in developing world, are more around the smart grid and metering technology and energy efficiency. That almost every country, maybe I won't be quite as broad, but all the countries I used to work in Africa were all capacity constrained. So for all of the utilities, greater efficiency and peak shaving is in their interest. So promoting energy efficiency was good for the customers and good for the utilities. That's not an alignment you always see in US markets. So things like pushing out CFLs instead of incandescents was actually very easy in a lot of countries, because people saw the benefits of it and the utilities saw the advantage of not having quite as high of a peak demand. I think you're going to see LEDs rolling out much faster in the developing world than you will in the US, partly due to lack of hang-up about lighting quality, but also just because the efficiency gains are so much more valuable. I also think with the metering, I showed the picture of the prepayment meters in Kenya. I think there's quite a bit more going on in some developing markets with prepaid meters, with being able to track people's electricity consumption, with people being able to just much better monitoring of that. And when you think operationally of how much less expensive that is, it's really something that I think could benefit the U.S. I don't think we're going to necessarily go to prepayment meters, but more smart meters, I think, is something that could be adopted elsewhere and then brought back here.
Jeff, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Just quickly on the microgrid piece, I mean, one of the things that sometimes you get a lot of different camps. Some folks are all about distributed energy in the energy access field, and some are all about large utilities. I've often made the argument that so many of the same principles, whether you're looking at the business model that you need to operate or the technologies, apply whether you're talking about microgrids or large utilities. And I think many of the issues we're finding in the microgrid space, when you look at high penetration of intermittent renewables and hybrid system controllers to work with distributed generation sources within that microgrid, apply regardless of the grid size, actually. And I think that's a potential area of interest. A higher level point I'd like to make is, traditionally when we think of innovation and tech transfer, the idea was it's coming from the developed world to the developing. Now the pendulum has swung pretty dramatically to, oh, the innovations are going to come from the developed, they need to be homegrown and come from the developed world. I would argue again for a bit of a balanced partnership model here, and there's a significant value to partnering with developed and developing country entities to look at innovations in this space that are applicable both for the developed and the developing world. Neither one, I would argue, can accomplish that job very effectively by themselves.
Thank you, sir. One thing I've been thinking about, we talked about this a little bit before the panel, and Richenda, I know this is in your network's report from last year, are these cross-sectoral approaches where you can get a couple of different things. Jeff, you mentioned the power and agriculture sector. I wanted to ask, this is probably a terrible question actually, it's a great way to preface it as well. Is there one of these sectors that has more bang for the buck in terms of long-term development capability, in the sense that getting power for the hospital, improving neonatal survival rates or life expectancy, does that translate into your best development bet? Or is it education and human capital and keeping the schoolhouse lit? Or is it simply getting the sustenance agriculture and improving yields? Is there work being done? Is there any particular lessons to be taken in terms of where you get the most bang for the buck in your development in terms of one of those sectors?
I'll take the first crack at that, but wearing my UN support hat here. Last year was the International Year of Sustainable Energy for All for the UN. The first time that, in fact, there has been any recognition by the UN as writ large around energy in that kind of designation through the General Assembly. And next year, 2014 to 2024, is the International Decade of Sustainable Energy for All. And the reason that I mention that is, in fact, the answer is yes, 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 and yes, which is that if you look at all the Millennium Development Goals, then in fact there is a role for energy services in terms of helping to meet all of those goals, whether you're looking at halving extreme poverty, whether you're looking at gender equity issues, whether you're looking at environment side, whether you're looking at health, and whether you're looking at excuse me, on the educational side as well. So I would say it really depends on where you're sitting, whether you say the best gains are on the health side or on the educational side. The answer is that you can see gains across all areas. One of the challenges has been that because energy and the need for energy services and reliable energy services is so pervasive, that unfortunately a lot of development players have neglected it. And I'm not talking about the bilateral institutions. I'm talking about a lot of the sort of the development organizations that will come from a healthcare angle, but not really look at necessarily at where, in fact, the energy can be the critical missing piece. As I say, let's just put it this way, an example. I work very closely with a doctor who lives half of the year in New York and half of the year in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And when he's in the DRC, he runs a clinic on the island of Elijah, I think it's called, or I'm probably not pronouncing it right, which is in Lake Kivu and has 250,000 people in the population. Until a year ago, he had no electricity at all for that clinic, which meant that after dark it closed. A year ago, a non-profit group came in with a what's called a solar suitcase, and again, this is the aid, but this is the inherent tension. This is where aid is good, but maybe over the long term, we can see whether there's a market solution. But with a specifically designed solar PV panel and lighting and a fetal heart rate monitor that was designed by an obstetrician with her solar engineer husband, specifically to address the high incidence of death of women during childbirth in many of these areas, even where they do have a clinic. And the interesting thing was that the emails that came back from the doctor was the first night that the lighting solution was in operation, he saved the lives of 2 women during difficult childbirth. And women tend not to go to the clinic during the day in that part of the DRC because they're still busy working in agriculture right until even during labor, and so they tend to only go to clinics in the evening, and there's a sort of a narrow time window if you don't have a solution. And then the second thing what he said was, he said that they also had a cholera epidemic fairly quickly after the solution set was installed, and for the first time in the history of that community, nobody died during the cholera outbreak because they could see again to work through the night to put the IVs into people's arms to give them the medication that they needed. So again, there's very, very strong support for these solution sets helping to save lives. And so I guess if I had to choose, I would say life saving probably comes near the top, but facilitating education, kids doing their homework, being able to read in the evening through something other than a kerosene-based light, which is bad for their health. There's so many different aspects that we can focus on. To the extent possible, clearly we want to make sure that that solar suitcase is maintained, is supported. So if you are coming in still with an aid-based approach, it needs to be a smart aid, if you will, where you're looking really at having that supply chain in place, where you're looking at something that's plug and play to the extent possible. So either it's low maintenance or you are putting that piece in place, working with a local provider who can maintain it. And that's where the sort of the tension comes in terms of trying to get it right.
Maybe I could offer a bit of perspective on the energy and ag nexus. If you can't eat, the vaccines aren't going to do you much good, right? Seriously, though, the FAO estimates a 70% agricultural intensification is going to be required to feed the world's population in the coming years. All along the agricultural value chain, energy inputs are required to achieve that intensification. One of the reasons we chose this area for the Grand Challenge focus is the positive feedback loop both in the energy sector and the agricultural sector. In many parts of Africa, 50% post-harvest losses are not uncommon. And a large part of that is insufficient cold chain. Similarly, we've been talking a lot about microgrids. And anyone that's looked at a utility before knows it's very difficult to operate a utility based on residential loads alone. And for most of these areas where we're going to need to seed microgrid development throughout the developing world, what are some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of light industry or commercial applications? Well, it's agriculture. So we thought that a combination of the positive feedback loop to the reducing post-harvest loss, increased production through cleaner and more cost-effective irrigation. Irrigation can be 10, 20, even 30% of a commodity's overall cost in many of these countries based on diesel irrigation, combined with anchor solid customers for some of these smaller grid solutions made a lot of sense when you looked at that nexus space.
So I was going to just say ditto all of the above, but I'd probably choose health. But instead I'm going to take a different angle. That I think there's too much focus in developing the developing world smarter on the bottom of the pyramid, on the education issues, on the health issues, on the basic agricultural needs. That you guys are at an ARPA-E conference. I'm guessing none of you are designing the next greatest solar lantern or really looking at health clinics in the developing world. But I think there's an extraordinary need also for greater reliability of supply in urban areas, in industrial areas, where a lot of the things that you're working on could make a significant impact on the economic development of these countries. So it's not just, everyone doesn't need to kind of race to the bottom. I was saying earlier that I keep meeting with companies that say, well, we think that if we can prove this will work in the Gambia, then we know our business model is great and we can scale it out from there. That's a terrible idea. I won't tell you which company it is. But if you're starting with the absolute most difficult environment, it's going to be really hard to grow. Why not start with the low-hanging fruit? If you're trying to run a successful business in Nigeria and your power goes out every single day, that's really hard to be profitable. Providing some sort of equipment that would improve their power supply, they're probably someone who can pay, and that's probably going to have a significant impact on their revenue, their workers, et cetera. So I think don't always go to the bottom of the pyramid. There's a lot of other opportunities in emerging markets that don't have to do with people in huts and these small-scale solutions.
Fantastic. We're actually coming close to the end of our panel here. I think we've got about 4 minutes left until our scheduled time. We did start a few minutes late, so I might be able to squeeze some more out. I don't know if we've got any questions coming from the crowdsourced Twitterverse out there. I think we've got a few coming up now. There's one question that piqued my curiosity in particular. I used to travel occasionally with former Secretary of State Clinton, for whom women's issues and things like the Global Cook Stove Initiative were of great importance. And at every stop in every country, there was a lot of talk about empowering women. She made the role of women a big part of her diplomacy. And I've noticed, one thing that I think you have stressed at different times, in a lot of these cases, I'm sorry to go back to the bottom of the pyramid, Kate, the users, the primary users, whether it's clean cook stoves, solar lanterns, small distributed sources of power, the primary users are in fact women. And when you do get to leverage that into a business, whether it's mobile phone rentals, things like that, it's also often women. And I wondered if there's anything in particular, this holds true for people who are designing or looking at distribution of applications, is there anything that says in particular about ease of use or follow-up service or particular design specifications that should be borne in mind when people are looking at this area?
Actually, to answer that, lightingafrica.org website has a great report on gender and off-grid lighting, which answers a lot of that. There's not much of a difference other than some of the functionality. The women that they interviewed tend to like portable lanterns better, something you can carry with you. But in terms of the value added, it's not much different.
I would just say it's basic customer research, which is know who your customers are. And one of the things I see is again with sort of external companies coming into emerging market communities, household settings, is this sort of sense that if you have a solution, it's the solution, and customer choice. Having solution sets to choose from. I think people have different opinions, have different, just like we do here. I'm sure we all like different types of light in our homes. It's not just a sort of a one-size-fits-all. I think. Women are, some women like some things, some like other things. It's not a sort of a one solution then you're done kind of market. I'm really looking to see much more competition, and we have it in some countries already in the small scale lighting sector. I want to see more because I think that's actually going to be good for the customer.
Fantastic. Hey, well, listen, thank you very much to all. I am told that we are now out of time. We're exactly on schedule, so that's good. I would like you to, if you could, give a round of applause to our panel who did a great job today explaining these issues. And we've still got time to catch some other sessions at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.